All right, let's start. So, today is George Whitefield. And we talked a little bit about him last week when we mentioned Jonathan Edwards. And it's been said, and probably rightly so, that when you talk about the Great Awakening of the colonial American period, Jonathan Edwards was by far the mind behind it. He was the intellect behind the theology and the philosophy and all of the doctrine. But Whitefield was the heart and the fire of it, really the centerpiece of it. He was the preaching evangelist. And that's what he was by trade. He was an evangelist. He wasn't a pastor. He wasn't a pastor like Jonathan Edwards was. He never really had a home church that he pastored week in and week out. Edwards, as famous as he was, he only stayed in his one church in Northampton, which in one sense is even more remarkable for him to become that well known, being in a home church like that. Whereas Whitefield traveled throughout the known Atlantic world, and we'll see how exactly that played out. So he was an evangelist, he wasn't a pastor, he was not a professor, he wasn't a professional theologian. His really heart and soul was a preacher in an evangelistic setting. And some have said, and maybe this is true, that he was the greatest evangelist in the history of the church since the Apostle Paul. And some would put him above Billy Graham and some of the other ones, but say he by far, at his time by far, was the greatest. But some say in the history of the church, he was the greatest evangelist of all time, since Paul. And he was a man who just would not stop. He absolutely would not stop, and he would not slow down. And many people have pointed out that he probably literally may have worked himself to death, because he did not slow down. He did not take many rests. He worked throughout the point where he became ill oftentimes. He would forego rest. He just wouldn't really take care of himself because he had this zeal to preach the gospel, and it was nonstop. He had about a 30-year career in terms of when he started ministry and when he died. And it's been estimated that he preached 30,000 sermons. 30,000. So that's obviously about 1,000 sermons a year. You can do the math. That's about 3 sermons a day, 6 to 7 days a week. And, not simple 20-minute, little Bible studies, hour-long sermons. Morning, afternoon, evening, preaching and preaching and preaching throughout his life. It was said that about 80% of the colonists in colonial America saw Whitefield because he was preaching up and down throughout his career, way more than anybody like a George Washington or any of the presidents to come later. Everybody knew of Whitefield. Most people saw him, and everybody at least heard of him. Some have pointed out that he probably was the very first celebrity in terms of how we think of celebrity today. Because in those days, the only name that everybody knew, and when you talk about the Anglo-American world, England and America, were names of royalty. Everyone knew the king's name. Everyone knew the prince or the queen, whatever. Outside of that, there was no new name that was known by everybody until Whitefield comes along, and he is just so popular, so famous that everybody knows George Whitefield. And we'll get into why exactly that is. The size of crowd that he preached to were estimated to be 10, 20, 30,000 people, which is a marvel in and of itself. He estimated himself one time a crowd of 80,000. Some have pointed out that's probably an exaggeration. But 10, 20, 30, a lot of people gave testimony to that. And critics, skeptics, even admirers today say that's probably not possible. 30,000 people in a pre-amplified age. How could, and this was all outside, obviously. We're not talking about a giant building with 30,000 people. This was outside. But even so, people said, how could Whitefield preach and speak that loud for 30,000 people to hear him? Well, Whitefield had a very famous friend named Benjamin Franklin, and Franklin himself was skeptical of that. And he wrote about this in his autobiography. He said this, quote, "I had the curiosity to learn how far he could be heard. By retiring backwards down the street from the Delaware River, I found his voice distinct till I came near Front Street. I then imagined a semicircle of which my distance could be the radius, and I filled it with auditors who I gave about 2 square feet, and I did all the math, and I computed that he may well be heard by more than 30,000 people." So Benjamin Franklin does himself a little experiment. He gets up right close. He said, I can hear him. And he keeps going all the way back to the point where you can't hear him anymore. And he kind of does his own little math experiment. And he said, yeah, 30,000 people sounds about right. Benjamin Franklin, the self-scientist, right? So, quite an unprecedented career. So, let's get into it. He was born in 1714 in England. So, he was an Englishman. He did spend a lot of time in America, so a lot of people consider him an American as well. I think he would be sympathetic to that. He really loved the colonial Americans, and in some respects, they treated him a lot better than some of his English brethren did. Born into a good Anglican family, his father died when he was 2 years old, so he never had really a father. Definitely never had a spiritual father figure. He had a stepfather, but he was really missing that father figure his entire upbringing. He was baptized as a baby, like any good Anglican English family would do. But early on, he starts to see in himself, though he was baptized as a baby, infant baptism in the Anglican Church. Because remember, the Anglican Church is still very Roman Catholic in its theology. You know, we talked about that when we talked about Henry VIII and all of that. And although he's baptized as a baby in his early years, he starts to see within himself his own sin. And he starts to see that he is a sinner, and he starts to have that guilty conscience that as you grow and, develop a sense of morality, right and wrong, he starts seeing that in his own self. So he says this when he's a young boy, quote, I can remember that such early stirrings of corruption in my heart as abundantly convinces me that I was conceived in sin, and that in me dwells no good thing by nature, and that if God had not freely prevented me by grace, I must have been forever banished from his presence. So he grows up with this conscience building in of sin, and he just can't quite understand it, because sort of the thought process was is that if you were baptized as a baby, you were kind of set. And he's just thinking to himself, why then do I have this guilty conscience of sin? As a young boy, he loved the theater. He loved the drama. He loved the stage, and he's really good at it. And even today, people criticize Whitefield and say, Whitefield was not a great preacher. He was a great dramatist. He was a great theatrical man, and he was a great monologuer and a Shakespearean actor, but he wasn't really a good preacher. And a lot of people, and Franklin said, no, that's not true. He was a good preacher. Franklin himself, they would become great friends, him and Whitefield. And Whitefield constantly was trying to share the gospel with Franklin, saying, you need to be born again, and you need to accept the divine gift of Jesus. And to the best we know, Franklin never did, but they were good friends, and it's an interesting friendship to kind of look at. So he enjoyed the theater, he loved the theater. He's smart enough to go to college, but he doesn't have enough money until he realizes he can go and as what's called a servitor. So he goes as a servitor to Oxford, and that is basically a way for him to study where you go to the university but you work as well. You're bringing people breakfast and you're making their beds, and he's basically a servant to some of the richer kids around there. He goes to Oxford, and he brings with him that guilty conscience of sin, and he meets other people there, and they form what's called this holy club. And I don't think they called it that. I think that was a name given to other people who sort of looked at this group and said, you guys think you're so much holier than all of us. You guys are the holy people. And really, it was composed of a bunch of this new religious sort of movement called the Methodists. They were a bunch of guys who were in the Anglican Church but were trying to purify it from within, and they had the mindset that true Christianity, true religion is not just going through the motions of the church day in, day out, week in, week out. It's having that heart for the gospel. It's having the inward sense of knowing who God is and having an inward sense of sin and coming to faith in Christ. There's more to it than just doing all the external stuff in the church. And the famous ones, of course, were the Wesley brothers, John and Charles Wesley. They were a part of this club. In hindsight, all three of them, Whitefield, John, and Charles Wesley, during the time in Oxford, none of them were actually saved. And we know that because they all admit to that. They were religious, they were pious, they were discipline in their religion, but none of them had experienced true salvation. John hadn't, Charles hadn't, and George hadn't. And they admit that later on in their life. So Whitefield goes and alongside everyone else, he's extreme in his religious discipline in an attempt to ease his guilty conscience. Praying, fasting, confession, chapel services, all of that. Up in the morning early to pray, late at night, all of that stuff. Sort of like Luther was, if you remember when we talked about Luther, to the point where he almost drove himself mad. Whitefield would walk outside when it was frigid cold in an attempt to discipline his body for godliness, and in process getting frostbite as well. It really changed when Charles Wesley, who again is not yet converted, gives Whitefield a book called The Life of God and the Soul of Man. And I don't know if it was a popular book at the time or whatever, but it was published in the 1670s. It may have been an obscure book, but it was a book that really drove home the point that true conversion to the Christian faith is not found in the checking the boxes of the church. It's not found in this, and that, but rather it's an inward sense of having the new birth, the second birth, right out of the language of John 3. When Jesus looks at Nicodemus and says, "You must be born again." And for Whitefield, this was sort of a light bulb. And he's around 21, 22 years old. And he suddenly realizes, I need that second birth. And that's what he would spend the rest of his career preaching to people. The new birth of Jesus Christ. To be born again. You were born once physically, you need to be born again from above. You need to have the second birth of salvation. So he graduates from Oxford around 22 or so. And he is wondering sort of where to go from there. And he feels the impulse to preach. He's in prayer one day, and he's conversing with God, and he said the word popped in his mind, "Speak out, Paul." And he takes that as, maybe a reference to, I'm going to be the next Paul. And maybe he came close in terms of his preaching ability. So, in 1736, he is a young man, and he preaches for the first time in his hometown and in a church. And he finds he likes it. And not only does he like it, he's good at it. And a big part of why he's so good at it is because of his theatrical talent. He was a great public speaker. He knew how to work a crowd. He knew how to speak. He was a brilliant orator. And when you're a good public speaker, when you can speak well, you can preach well. They go hand in hand. He starts preaching, and as he's preaching, people start coming. He's in London, he's in Oxford. Then all of a sudden he receives a letter from his friend John Wesley, who he would associate John to be his spiritual father figure. John was a little bit older than him, but he said he never really had a father. He considered John his father figure. John is over in this new colony across the ocean in Georgia, in Savannah, Georgia. John Wesley writes him a letter to George, and he says, quote, "Does your heart burn within you to turn others to righteousness? Behold, the whole land," talking about America, "thousands and thousands are before you. Who will bring them up in the nurture and the admonition of the Lord? Here are adults from the farthest parts of Europe, Asia, and the inmost kingdoms of Africa. Add to these the known and unknown natives of this vast continent, and you will indeed have a great multitude which no man can number." So he said, "Look, there's a bunch of people over here, George. Come over here. There's work that needs to be done." He thinks about it, and he decides, all right, I will. He doesn't go right away. He's still preaching. He spends some time preaching in London and Oxford. And as his fame grows, what begins to happen is he starts running into problems with the established Church of England. And one guy put it good, I think. He said, Whitefield became too evangelical for the well-groomed Church of England. And there was a lot of different problems in terms of the theological precision, but what it really came down to, when Whitefield was putting so much emphasis into the fact that you need to be born again or you will not see the kingdom of God. And if you're talking to really middle class, higher class, any civilized person in England, all of them had been baptized as a baby. And Whitefield pointed, that is not enough. You need to be born again. And I think it was very personal for Whitefield because he was baptized as a baby and he saw that that did nothing for his guilty conscience of sin. So he would preach in the new birth and the second birth like Jesus did to Nicodemus. And that really got him in a lot of trouble. And people began to start banning him from their churches. And some have pointed out it probably had a lot to do with jealousy, because here's this young 20-year-old who had grown in popularity and fame, and established ministers were struggling to keep their places afloat. So there probably was some envy and jealousy there as well.
Hey, Ryan?
Yeah.
When you're saying born again, was he saying adult baptism, or was he just saying a confession of faith?
Both. But his main thing is he's distinguishing infant baptism, saying that's not going to do it. Mm-hmm. So you need to have the new birth from above in the heart, and then have believer's baptism.
Okay.
Yeah. Yep.
Well, that became somewhat difficult during that period of time, as people tried to understand how and when did this take place.
Right.
And part of that nurtured the movement in the late 1700s in the United States, where they used to have huge brush arbor meetings with 15,000, 20,000 people there, and preachers preaching all over the place, and people were looking for a way to, it was described later as to come through, to receive this spiritual blessing, and there was somewhat a struggle as to understand how this happens.
Right. And Whitefield, I think main thing was he was distinguishing the two, especially from infant baptism, because he was saying, look, if you're saved through infant baptism, then everyone's saved, because everyone in the Church of England was baptized as an infant. And he was saying, if that's true, then everyone's saved. And he said that's not true, because we have a lot of what he called baptized heathens running around, which is a good term. Baptized heathens. So he does go to America in 1736. Later on, he sails to Savannah, Georgia for the first time. He doesn't stay there long because he needs to go back to be officially ordained as a priest in the Anglican Church in England. So he's not there very long. But one thing he does do while he's there is he sees the need for an orphanage, basically. But Whitefield was very theologically driven, but he also was able to put that to practice in terms of social work and social good. So he sees that there's a need for an orphanage, so he decides he's going to build an orphanage. And he commits it to himself, and he commits it to the papers and all of that. And one of the things he does is he goes back to England in an effort to raise money for this orphanage. He ends up building one, and it's still there today. It's not an orphanage. I think it's a school called Bethesda Academy in Savannah, Georgia. And I think one of the buildings is still there, I think, from when Whitefield was laying down bricks. So he goes back again, and when he goes back to England, he's still in a lot of conflict with the officials of England, mainly because he's preaching so much emphasis on the new birth in opposition to what a lot of the officials were teaching. So one thing Whitefield decides to do is he decides to move his preaching outside, which was unprecedented. It had happened before, I'm sure. People would preach outside, but never really in a church setting. Because there's something sacred about a building, and there's something sort of holy about being indoors in a church building, nice cathedrals, all of that. So to move outside was sort of a different move. Nobody was really doing it. But he does it because he knows he's not welcome in a lot of churches, and he knows that whenever he gets into a church, many people want to hear him preach but can't, because they're breaking the fire code. There's just not enough room in these buildings to confine all the people that want to hear him. So he moves outside. Anyone can come see him. I mean, there's not going to be a bunch of cramped spaces. People aren't going to be hanging out on the roofs and on the organ lofts like people said was happening. And then everyone could come here and preach. And what Whitefield finds is when he goes out to the countryside, he draws a group of very unlikely people that would not show their face in church, these coal miners. Because coal miners back then, at least in England, they weren't welcome in the church. People viewed them as suspicion. They were sort of the down and outers. They were the rougher crowd. And Whitefield goes out to the countryside, and he writes, I don't think he said this out loud, but he writes maybe in his journal that, come out of your den of thieves and out of the pits of hell to hear the gospel, in something of that language. And he writes that about 10,000 people come and hear him preaching to these coal miners in the countryside of England. So what happens is he is growing and growing in popularity and fame. He is becoming very, very popular, not only in England, but also in the States, because a lot of his literature was being transmitted over across the ocean to America and then being published, a lot of them by a young, struggling publisher named Ben Franklin. It was also around this time that he starts to develop a falling out with his really good friend, John Wesley. And a part of it was to the fact that Whitefield was becoming way more famous than Wesley was, and started to treat Wesley not so much as a brother, but more as one historian put it, a lieutenant in his ministry, sort of commanding Wesley what to do and all of that stuff. But a lot of it really had to do with theology. And simply put, John Wesley was an Arminian, and Whitefield was a Calvinist. And you know that if probably any other doctrine would divide churches and friendships, and more than anyone, it would be the doctrine of divine election, Arminianism, and Calvinism. I think it's fair to say, to Whitefield's credit, Whitefield, I think, would have been fine to live with the differences. Wesley was not. And in their private letters and correspondence, Wesley was sort of threatening Whitefield that he was going to go public with all of this. And Whitefield didn't quite want that. He didn't want a public brawl, but eventually Wesley did. And he published a tract called Free Grace. And in it, he attacks the doctrine of divine election and limited atonement and all of the Calvinistic ideas. And he says things like this: you, quote, represent God as worse than the devil. And though he never named Whitefield, everybody knew what this was about. He was attacking George Whitefield and his Calvinist theology. And it would be a while before Whitefield would publicly attack back, but he eventually would. And it became a very rocky relationship between the two. And they just disagreed on a lot of things. Wesley, for example, taught that you can achieve full sanctification and full holiness in this life. You know, the Christian life is all about growing in godliness and in holiness to the point where you become holy. And Wesley said you can reach that in this life. Whitefield said, no, you can't. That's going to happen in a glorified state in the kingdom of God. We will never reach full holiness here in a sinful body and in a sinful world. Wesley said you could lose your salvation. Whitefield said, no, you can't lose something that's eternal. That's an oxymoron. Wesley rejected the doctrine of election and limited atonement, and Whitefield did not. So they disagreed on a lot, and unfortunately it took a toll on their friendship. In November of 1739, Whitefield goes back to America, and this time he goes, as one historian says, quote, the sensation of the British Atlantic world. He is famous. He is well known. And when he goes to Philadelphia, when he'd gone to Savannah prior, nobody knew who he was. But this time when he comes to Philadelphia, everybody knows who he was. And they just heard of this guy, and they wanted to hear him speak. They just heard this guy was a master orator. He was a master communicator. Maybe they had no interest in religion, but I'm going to go to hear what this hype is all about with this George Whitefield guy. You know, you should think of the conversation. Is it really true? 20,000 people hear him? It's true you can hear him from that far back? How in the world did that happen? So he was a sensation when he arrived. So when he arrived, one of the first things he does is he's looking for a publisher to start publishing all of his material. And somebody said, oh, the best in town is this guy over here named Ben Franklin. Ben Franklin was not famous and well known at the time. And Franklin jumped at the opportunity to publish this guy's stuff. And that's in large part how he became so popular and wealthy and well known. And they developed a friendship. And again, Whitefield constantly was imploring on him to receive Christ and accept Christ. One of the most interesting letters he wrote to that Whitefield wrote to Franklin was after Franklin did his experiment in electricity, when he flies the kite and all that. Whitefield writes him a letter and he said, congratulations on your success on the mysteries of electricity. Then he said, I now urge you to study the mysteries of the new birth. So that's clever. From this point on, when he arrives in America in 1739, for the next year and a couple months, he would be constantly on the move. And we could trace it in terms of here he went here, first he went here, then he went there, but it would almost just be overwhelming because it would point A to point B at a rapid rate of speed, horseback up and down the East Coast. But a couple things to note about his travels. The first is this: Whitefield was a celebrity wherever he went. He drew crowds wherever he went, especially in his younger days. As he got older, they sort of dwindled down because a lot of the hype was to just hear what the hype was all about. And then maybe once you've heard him, I don't need to go back and see him again. But in his early days, he was a sensation. Whenever he went to new towns, 10, 20, 30,000 people would come and hear him speak. Number two, he often drew large crowds up to the tens of thousands. Number three, he preached multiple times a day, oftentimes into the night, multiple times a week. Often forgoing, again, his own personal health. And then number four, he had many admirers, but he had many critics, and of whom Wesley was one of them. Many of the publishers in the American would criticize him. He also had his share of violent attacks. So a lot of times people would go to his preaching events and sermon with the intent on heckling him, screaming, all of that stuff. And sometimes it got fairly violent where people were throwing eggs, milk. One time a dead cat was thrown at him. And there was a couple attempted assassinations on his life that he narrowly escaped. So he had critics in the paper, and he had a couple physical attacks as well. And because whenever you preach the gospel, you're engaging in the battleground of Satan, who hates that, and he's going to do whatever he can to, if anything, if he could, kill you. So he leaves. He goes back to Savannah. He starts laying brick down for the orphanage. Spends some time in South Carolina. He goes back to Philadelphia. And in his quest to raise money, he would always do his sermons and then mention his orphanage down in Savannah. Franklin attends one of them, and he knows that Whitefield's going to ask for money, and Franklin doesn't want to give him money because Franklin had no problem with building an orphanage. Franklin, though, said, you should build one in a place like Philadelphia. Why are you doing it way down in Savannah, Georgia? What's down there? I mean, there's nothing down there. That's a brand new colony. Build one here, and I'm not going to give you money. And then Franklin goes to one of his sermons, and he writes this, quote, I silently resolved that he should get nothing from me. I had in my pocket a handful of copper money, $3 or $4. As he proceeded to speak, I began to soften, and then I concluded I would give the copper. Another stroke of his oratory made me so ashamed, and I determined to give him the silver, and he finished so admirably that I emptied my pocket wholly into the collector's dish, gold and all. He goes down to South Carolina again. He makes his way back up to New England, spends some time in Rhode Island and Boston. In Boston, he speaks to 35,000 people, one of the largest gatherings ever in Boston. He then makes his way west, and had not a certain pastor, I'm talking west of Massachusetts, had not a certain pastor been out there named Jonathan Edwards, he probably wouldn't have gone. But he wanted to see this guy Edwards, and he wanted to meet him. He had heard of him already because he had been reading a lot of the works of Edward while he was in England, especially Edward's thoughts on the revival and all of that. So he goes and he meets Edwards, and he spends more time than he normally spends in any town with Edwards, and they develop a little bit of a friendship. He preaches in Edwards' church, and Edwards invites him, really. And you remember we touched on this last week a little bit. Edward wanted to revive the flame of revival that had sort of been dwindling down a little bit. And he wanted George Whitefield to come and preach. Edward wrote that Whitefield moved his entire congregation to tears, including Edwards. Whitefield, by the way, really had a lot of nice things to say about Edward's wife, Sarah. He spoke about how she was one of the most godly women he had ever come across, and how her godliness and her devotion to Jonathan and her devotion to the God and her godly womanhood inspired him to pray more and more for a wife that he had had. He had actually proposed prior to a woman in England, but was denied. So he eventually would marry.
I just said ouch.
Yeah.
That hurts.
Yep. You don't win them all. One of the things Edward does do is when Whitefield leaves, Edwards accompanies him and they have a horseback ride to the next town. And Edwards sort of gives Whitefield 2 points of contention or criticism that he feels he should share. The first one is he felt Whitefield was relying too much on spiritual impulses, which a lot of people have criticized on Whitefield. Because Whitefield would do things like he would get up to the pulpit and he said, I spent 2 days studying to preach on this, but as I was walking up the stairs, the Spirit told me to speak on this. And Whitefield's ministry would obviously Spirit-led, Spirit-filled, but Edwards thought Whitefield was putting a little too much emphasis on the spiritual impulses. And he was saying things like, George, how do you know you're listening to the Spirit and not the flesh, or maybe your own impulses? How are you distinguishing the two? Maybe don't put as much on these impulses you seem to get all the time. And the second one he said was, Whitefield had a habit of questioning the salvations of a lot of his critics. And Edwards said, maybe you shouldn't just call all of these critics if you're unregenerate, what was one of them? Soldiers of Satan or something like that. He said, you should probably be a little more careful on calling a lot of these ministers who have been in ministry 40 years or so unbelievers, just because they don't agree with what you're saying. And by those 2 points, by the way, Whitefield would later on reflect on in his life and said, I think I did give a little too much impulse on the Spirit. And I probably shouldn't have questioned so many people's salvations, especially when you barely know them. The whole line, when Jesus said you will know them by their fruits, that is certainly true, but the whole point is knowing them by their fruits, not knowing them off a one-time conversation. It does take time to discern the spiritual fruit of individuals. So he eventually leaves in 1748. Again, it's a super productive year for Whitefield in terms of ministry work. He is all over the place. He eventually goes back to England, and he knows he has to confront, or maybe not confront, but deal with this problem he has with John Wesley. So he publishes a letter to the Reverend John Wesley in answer to the sermon that he preaches entitled Free Grace. And it just really further solidified the rocky friendship they have. He goes over to Scotland, spends some time preaching in Scotland. He comes back to England, and he actually eventually does marry, and he marries a woman named Elizabeth James. And they have a baby, name him John, after John the Baptist, but unfortunately the baby does not survive past infancy. And Whitefield went back preaching the next couple of days. And many people have pointed out, for criticism toward Whitley, he didn't seem to be a great husband. And people have said, could you imagine being married to this guy? Because he just never sat down, didn't really have a home. And if you were to be married to him, it was the lifestyle you were choosing as well. So people have said, I just couldn't imagine being married to George Whitefield. In 1744, he goes back to America, and in an example of probably how he wasn't the best husband, he actually leaves his wife in America, goes down to the Caribbean island to do some work there. His wife wants to go back to England. She doesn't really like America as much, and he actually sails off to England without telling her and leaving her in America. So when she found out about that, she wasn't happy, and then she sailed over to England to tell him that. In 1749, Benjamin Franklin sends him a letter with a proposal to build a school in Pennsylvania. And he said, we need a school, and the idea was we need to build a school that has no denominational affiliation. Because Harvard and Yale and Princeton, they were all there, but they were specifically designed for a specific denomination, to train specific pastors of the Puritan denomination or whatever it may be. So Franklin sends him a proposal. He said, let's make the school. Whitefield reads it over, and he sends him a letter back, and he said, everything looks great except that it has no Christ. And Franklin said, well, it does. It's just way down in the bottom of the list. And Whitefield said, of course, it needs to be in the center of the list. But they eventually do build it, and it becomes the University of Pennsylvania. Now, as the years dwindle down, Whitefield sort of begins to burn out. Because again, he's constantly on the road. He's preaching long hour sermon, 2, 3, 4 times a day after day, week after week. He crosses the Atlantic 13 times between his mission work from England to America, preaching on the ship to anyone who would listen as well. He said toward the end of his life, "God knows how long I am to drag this crazy load along. I am sick of myself, sick of the world, sick of the church, and I am panting daily after the full enjoyment of my God." So he really come to the point where he said, "I'll keep working, but I'm wearing down, and I'm coming to the point now where I'm just longing to be with God in heaven." He does die in Massachusetts in 1770, at a time where the spirit of the American Revolution is starting to creep up a little bit. And many have pointed out that Whitefield was very instrumental in unifying all the colonies toward independence, freedom, not really to the point of disavowing from the crown. He never really quite got there, but he did seem to promote a unity of Protestant English-speaking people. Let me read you two things from contemporaries of his of how he spoke. Franklin said this: "Every accent, every emphasis, every modulation of voice was so perfectly well turned and well placed that without being interested in the subject, one could not help but be pleased with the discourse, a pleasure of much the same kind that without received from an excellent piece of music." Sarah Edwards, Jonathan's wife, said, "He is a born orator. You have already heard of his deep toned yet clear and melodious voice. It is perfect music to listen to alone. You remember that David Hume, who was a skeptic of religion and all of that, who was a contemporary, you remember that David Hume thought it worth going 20 miles to hear him speak. And Garrick, who was an actor at the time, Garrick said that, quote, he could move men to tears in pronouncing the word Mesopotamia." As Sarah continuing, "It is truly wonderful to see what a spell this preacher often cast over an audience by proclaiming the simplest truth of the Bible. A prejudiced person, I know, might say, all of this is theatrical artifice and display, but not so will anyone think who had seen him and known him. He is a very devout and godly man, and only aims to reach and influence men the best way. He speaks from the heart with all aglow and love and pours out a torrent of eloquence which is almost irresistible." And again, she says, you may think that this is all theater and art and stuff. And again, that criticism would live on even today. People would say, he was just a master actor. He was just a brilliant communicator, not so much a great preacher of the gospel. But most of his contemporaries say, no, that's not true. He was certainly a great preacher. So you combine his oratory skills and his passion for the gospel and his passion for the new birth that sinners need to come to faith in Christ. And it's no wonder he was drawing 10, 20, 30,000 people to his sermons. One last point, and then a quick story, and then we'll close. So we've said before, the best man is the man at best, right? Every single person we've studied this summer had their faults. They have their sin. They have their criticism. We talked a little bit about Luther and I think some others. Whitefield, he was criticized for his theology, obviously, some of his practices, his marriage a little bit. But by far the one that really looms over is his view on slavery. Because Whitefield would become a slave owner in colonial Georgia. And he was one who advocated for Georgia to legalize slavery. And when Whitefield first came to America, he actually published some tracts calling out slavery, calling out the abusiveness of some of the slave masters, saying, you treat your animal better than you treat your slave. And he said, we need to preach the gospel to slaves. We need to preach the gospel to the slaves of the northern and the southern colonies. And we need to educate them and learn them how to read. Now, that may not sound like a lot, but back then, that was radical. Nobody was saying that. But he does, when he gets the opportunity, he is sold a slave in order to help build his plantation and his orphanage in Georgia. And many people have pointed that out. Nobody pointed it out back then when it happened, because nobody really thought that way. Nobody thought that it was a moral problem back then. It was just the way it was. John Wesley didn't publicly come out against slavery until after Whitefield died. John Newton, the captain of the slave ship who became a Christian, didn't come out against it until after Whitefield died. So it is a reminder that the best man is a man at best. And a lot of people have tried to defend it, saying, Whitefield was a product of his time. And we're all products of our time. But as Christians, we're more than that. Because our standard is never the time that we live in. Our standard is never the culture. Our standard is always what God says. And no matter what the culture says, no matter what the world says, no matter what the people say, no matter what the government says, no matter what the media says, no matter what they say, we still have one standard that doesn't change. And I think Whitefield, to his credit, tried to live by that. One historian said Whitefield needed a Bible verse that says, you shall not own slaves. And Whitefield was reading the Bible, and he was reading the words of Paul that said, be nice to your slaves. And he was coming to the best conclusion he could. But he was wrong. And, it goes to show that everyone we study, unless we're studying the Lord Jesus Christ, will have their faults and fail. And we learn from that, and we're mindful that 100 years from now, people are going to criticize us.
I'm just curious, was his wife in America with him when he died? Did she come back with him?
Yeah, I'm not sure. Yeah, I don't know. Good question. Yep.
Just curious.
Yeah. Yep.
Probably couldn't keep up with it. I mean, just,
I don't know. Yeah.
dude's on the move all the time.
Right. Does anyone have any other final thoughts, questions?
Well, the battle of Arminianism and Calvinism was, and still is, it's bipolar.
Yeah.
It's a whole different way of looking at things. Of course, Jacob Arminius was a very brilliant man on his own.
Right.
But Calvin was more well-read.
Right.
And
Yeah. And I think there are truths in both of them. Yeah, I really do. One last story. Many people went to hear Whitefield preach, again, if not for anything else, but to hear his oratory skills. One of them was a young man who went with the intent with some of his friends to heckle him, right, and to call him out and maybe throw some things at him and all of that. And he gets there, and Whitefield is preaching on one of the verses in Matthew when Jesus said, "You brood of vipers, who warned you from the wrath to come." And he is just overtaken by this guy in his preaching of the gospel. And he leaves, overcome with his sin and his guilty conscience of sin. And he ends up becoming a Christian, and he becomes saved. And his name was Robert Robinson. And he would go on to write the hymn, "Come thou fount of every blessing, tune my heart to sing thy grace." And he would have his own story and his own career and his own ministry. But it all started when he went to see this guy, George Whitefield, preach. All right. Anyone have anything else final? If not, we will close.
In this one, that's stood out 56 years. And I think all the guys who studied and the names, they died out. As I look at the dates, 60s, 70s, I don't think any of them made it to 80 or 90.
Right. It sort of shows you the time back then. You didn't have a long life. Nobody was expected to live that long. Franklin was an outlier. Lived like close to 90. All right.